Section 17, page 78. I looked through the papers you gave to the Mr. Littlebear, he said at length. Well, can there be anything more abominable? No, she changed her position slightly, screening her eyes with her lifted hand. Of course, you know, Archer continued, that if your husband chooses to fight the case, as he threatens to, yes, he can say things that might be disagreeable to you. Say them publicly so that they will get about and harm you even no matter how unfounded they were. She paused for a long interval, so long that, not wishing to keep his eyes on her shaded face, he had time to imprint on his mind the exact shape of her other hand, the one on her knee, and every detail of the 3 rings on her fourth and fifth fingers, among which, he noticed, a wedding ring did not appear. What harm could such accusations, even if he made them publicly, do me here? It was on his lips to exclaim, "My poor child, far more harm than anywhere else." Instead, he answered, in a voice that sounded in his ears like Mr. Littlebear's, "New York society is a very small world compared with the one you have lived in, and it's ruled, in spite of appearances, by a few people with, well, rather old-fashioned ideas." She said nothing, and he continued, "Our ideas about marriage and divorce are particularly old-fashioned. Our legislation favors divorce. Our social customs don't. Never? Well, not if the woman, however injured, however irreproachable, has appearances in the least degree against her, has exposed herself by any unconventional action to offense, insinuations." She dropped her head a little lower, and he waited again, intensely hoping for a flash of indignation, or at least a brief cry of denial. None came. A little traveling clock ticked purringly at her elbow, and a log broke into and sent up a shower of sparks. The whole hushed and brooding room seemed to be waiting silently with Archer. "Yes," she murmured at length. "That's what my family tell me." He winced a little. "It is not unnatural. Our family," she corrected herself, and Archer colored. "For you will be my cousin's son," she continued gently. "I hope so." "And you take their view?" He stood up, wandered across the room, stared with wide eyes at one of the pictures against the old red damask, and came back irresolutely to her side. How could he say yes if what your husband hints is true, or if you have no way of disproving it? "Sincerely," she interjected, as he was about to speak. He looked down into the fire. "Sincerely, then, what should you gain that would compensate for the possibility, the certainty of a lot of beastly talk?" "But my freedom, is that nothing?" It flashed across him at that instant that the charge in the letter was true, and that she hoped to marry the partner of her guilt. How was he to tell her that, if she really cherished such a plan, the laws of state were inexorably opposed to it? The mere suspicion that the thought was in her mind made him feel harshly and impatiently toward her. "But aren't you as free as air as it is?" he returned. "Who can touch you? Mr. Littlebear tells me the financial question has been settled." "Ah, yes," she said indifferently. "Well then, is it worthwhile to risk what may be infinitely disagreeable and painful? Think of the newspapers, their violence. It's all stupid and narrow and unjust, but one can't make over society." "No," she acquiesced, and her tone was so faint and desolate that he felt a sudden remorse for his own hard thoughts. The individual, in such cases, is nearly always sacrificed to what is supposed to be collective interest. People cling to any convention that keeps the family together, protects the children, if there are any," he rambled on, pouring out all the stock phrases that rose to his lips in his intense desire to cover over the ugly reality. which her silence seemed to have laid bare. Since she wouldn't or couldn't say the one word that would have cleared the air, his wish was not to let her feel that he was trying to probe into her secret. Better keep on the surface, in the prudent old New York way, than risk uncovering a wound he could not heal. It is my business, he went on, to help you to see these things as the people who are fondest of you see them. The Mingotts, the Vellons, the Van der Luydens, all of your friends and relations. If I didn't show you honestly how they judge such questions, it wouldn't be fair of me, will it? He spoke insistently, almost pleading with her in his eagerness to cover up that yawning silence. She said slowly, "No, it wouldn't be fair." The fire had crumbled down to grayness, and one of the lamps made a gurgling appeal for attention. Madame Alaska rose, wound it up, and returned to the fire, but without resuming her seat. Her remaining on her feet seemed to signify that there was nothing more for either of them to say. And Archer stood up also. "Very well, I will do what you wish," she said abruptly. The blood rushed to his forehead, and taken aback by the suddenness of her surrender, he caught her two hands awkwardly in his. I do want to help you," he said. "You do help me. Good night, my cousin." He bent and laid his lips on her hands, which were cold and lifeless. She drew them away, and he turned to the door, found his coat and hat under the faint gaslight of the hall, and plunged out into the winter night, bursting with the belated eloquence of the inarticulate. Chapter 13. It was a crowded night at Velox Theatre. The play was the Sheragon, with the Dion Boucicault in the title role and Harry Montague and Ada Diaz as the lovers. The popularity of the admirable English company was at its height, and the Sheragon always packed the house. In the galleries the enthusiasm was unreserved. In the stalls and boxes people smiled a little at the hackneyed sentiments and claptrap situations, and enjoyed the play as much as the galleries did. There were one episode in particular that held the house from floor to ceiling. It was that in which Harry Montague, after a sad, almost monosyllabic scene of parting with Miss Diaz, bade her goodbye and turned to go. The actress, who was standing near the mantelpiece and looking down into the fire, wore a grey cashmere dress without fashionable loopings or trimmings, molded to her tall figure and flowing in long lines about her feet. Around her neck was a narrow black velvet ribbon, with the ends falling down her back. When her wooer turned from her, she rested her arms against the mantelshelf and bowed her face in her hands. On the threshold, he paused to look at her. Then he stole back, lifted one of the ends of velvet ribbon, kissed it, and left the room without her hearing him or changing her attitude. And on this silent parting, the curtain fell. It was always for the sake of that particular scene that Newland Archer went to see the Sheragon. He thought the adieus of Montague and Ada Devas as fine as anything he had ever seen Croisset and Brissant do in Paris, or Madge Robertson and Kendall in London. In its reticence, its dumb syrup, it moved him more than the most famous histrionic outpourings. On the evening in question, the little scene acquired an added poignancy by reminding him, he couldn't have said why, of his leave-taking from Madame Alaska after their confidential talk a week or 10 days earlier. It would have been as difficult to discover any resemblance between the two situations as between the appearance of the persons concerned. Newland Archer couldn't pretend to anything approaching the young English actor's romantic good looks, and Miss Diaz was a tall, red-haired woman of monumental build, whose pale and pleasantly ugly face was utterly unlike Ellen Alaska's vivid countenance. Nor were the Archer and Madame Alaska two lovers parting in heartbroken silence. They were client and lawyer separating after a talk, which had given the lawyer the worst possible impression of the client's case. Wherein, then, lay the resemblance that made the young man's heart beat with a kind of retrospective excitement. It seemed to be in Madame Alaska's mysterious faculty of suggesting, trudging and moving possibilities outside the daily run of experience. She had hardly ever said a word to him to produce this impression, but it was a part of her, either a projection of her mysterious and outlandish background or of something inherently dramatic, passionate, and unusual in herself. Archer had always been inclined to think that chance and circumstance played a small part in shaping people's lots, compared with their innate tendency to have things happen to them. This tendency he had felt from the first Madame Alaska. The quiet, almost passive young woman struck him as exactly the kind of person to whom things were bound to happen, no matter how much he shrank from them and went out of her way to avoid them. The exciting fact was her having lived in an atmosphere so thick with drama that her own tendency to provoke it had apparently passed unperceived. It was precisely the odd absence of surprise in her that gave him the sense of her having been plucked out of a very maelstrom. The things she took for granted gave the measure of those she had rebelled against. Archer had left her with the conviction that Count Olenski's accusation was not unfounded. The mysterious person who figured in his wife's past as the secretary had probably not been unrewarded for his share in her escape. The conditions from which she had fled were intolerable. Past speaking of, past believing. She was young, she was frightened, she was desperate. What more natural than that she should be grateful to her rescuer? The pity was that her gratitude put her, in the law's eyes and the world's, on a par with her abominable husband. Archer had made her understand this, as he was bound to do. He had also made her understand that the simple-hearted, kindly New York, on whose larger charity she had apparently counted, was precisely the place where she could least hope for the indulgence. To have to make this fact plain to her, and to witness her resigned acceptance of it, had been intolerably painful to him. He felt himself drawn to her by obscure feelings of jealousy and pity, as if her dumbly confessed error had put her at his mercy, humbling yet endearing her. He was glad it was to him she had revealed her secret, rather than to the cold security of Mr. Letterblair, or the embarrassed gaze of her family. He immediately took it upon himself to assure them both that she had given up her idea of seeking a divorce, basing her decision on the fact that she had understood the uselessness of the proceeding, and with infinite relief they had all turned their eyes from the unpleasantness she had spared them. I was sure Newland would manage it, Miss Welland had said proudly of her future son-in-law, and old Miss Mingott, who had summoned him for a confidential interview, had congratulated him on his cleverness, and added impatiently, "Silly goose, I told her myself what nonsense it was, wanting to pass herself off as Ellen Mingott, that an old maid, when she has the luck to be married woman, and a countess." End of the section, page 83.